sorry to interrupt all the conversations, but I don't want to use up all the time that we have here. So, first of all, thank you all for coming on this really chilly winter night. It's gotten really cold, and the fact that you guys came from all around London to come and be part of something really special and really new means so much to me, and it means so much to Yusuf, who has been with me from the start of this process, and thank you to Lacan, who made us meet each other. So, I want to welcome you all to the LSPPS. We're not set on the name yet, we might shorten it, it's a bit long, but anyway, we're very, very happy to have all of you. So, the way we want to start is, we want to assess about the mid-20th century, what's been going on with philosophy and what's been going on with philosophy now. And the dominance of analytic philosophy, stuff that we do at school, stuff that they teach us in our master's programs, especially in the English-speaking world and German-speaking world, the continental, it's pushed forward a lot of ideas of clarity, formal logic. For those who have studied philosophy, you know how annoying it is to do proof theory, you know how annoying it is to do all these things. But the pushing forward ideas of clarity and formal logic, such as they did at school, and after the rise of Wittgenstein, scientific rigor, linguistic analysis, of course, that's where the Kant of his theories from the development of Freud. And of course, in Kant, we have the impact of Marxism, and then of course in neo-Marxist schools that come from that, such as Lukács and other things. But the subject of what we're trying to do now is to look at what is the subject in and of itself. That's what the seminar is for, to understand that, and to understand kind of the things that Lacan's putting forward in his work. We have to understand what it means by the term subjectivity. But the attempts to by philosophy to make sense of the idea and to categorize the subject as a whole, it has drawn up short, in our opinion. And this is something that Yusuf and I have discussed a lot in person about where the limits of analytic philosophy are. And this is not to insult anyone who's doing analytic philosophy in itself, but the whole point of the LSPPS is to try to figure out if there's a countercurrent and ways to merge two different and very conflicting ways of thinking. One of my favorite philosophers, Dragan in Techniques and Time, introduced the idea that metaphysics has died, or there is some sort of finality in metaphysics, which sounds a bit strange. But he argued that the entire history of metaphysical development, in the West especially, has tried to condense human knowledge and experience into metaphysics universalis, which is a totalizing, totalizable calculable system of knowledge. This was done by, this was a dream that was sort of developed first by Descartes and by Leibniz to try to sort of make sense of human existence in mathematical rational terms. But borrowing from views such as Martin Heidegger and in Stucker's view, our distance and alienation from the world in and of itself is exactly what fuels this metaphysical drive to be and to have a totalizing understanding of what it means to be a being in the world. So the human itself is already alienated from its entire surroundings, from the structure, what it means to be, and simultaneously, the fact that we desire this totalization, the fact that we desire to condense philosophical knowledge into formalizing systems, already says something very interesting about the process that we're doing here, hence the term desire. The term desire is crucial. Once desire is recognized as constitutive of experience, the limits of purely analytic philosophy or purely materialist frameworks become clear. We cannot really understand what it means to be a subject without understanding what it means for one to have an unconscious, symbolic structures, and the dynamics of desire that shape thought and action. So for this reason, the LSPPS does not want to treat psychoanalysis as some strange foreign intruder or some dark science developed by Freud and some other perverted thinkers, but no, we want to sort of merge it with philosophy as a necessary continuation of what the Frankfurt School tried to do and where they drew short. And it's to try to separate rationality from subjectivity itself, critique from psychic life, or theory from the structural desires. We want to do exactly the opposite. We want to see if there's a way that we can make it work. So we're not a school, maybe we'll get there one day, but we're a collective first and foremost, and that means that we care about all of your opinions, especially all of you have managed to come here tonight. We want to build something together, and we want to find ways to bridge philosophy, of course, which is the work of the thinker, and to recognize at the same time that in the very structures that we do our thinking, they're in some sense dictated by the inner workings or mechanisms that we don't have that much control over. But in some sense, we can only communicate through symbols, metaphors, memories, illusions, art, movies. So we're not going to limit ourselves to philosophy and psychoanalysis itself. We're going to look at culture theory as a whole and how it relates to both these two things. So there's a few aims that we have. One obviously is community. Being a philosopher is isolating, right? But we want to sort of bring people together to have and share ideas. We're going to start doing reading groups. We're going to start doing movie sessions, a lot more cultural activities as well. To try to, there's a lot of people in this room right now who share a lot of similar ideas and we're bringing together to do that. So community means cultivating space of conversation where we can disagree about certain things, agree about others, and come to specific conclusions that may or may not be true, and stuff that we can continue to research. We want also to have this space we want for exploration. So we want to go beyond typical frameworks. A lot of societies are very stringent and don't like to produce work because they are afraid of fall beyond some sort of guidelines, and they're very strict with their journals and specifically what they want in their journals. And you know how it's been. If you apply to a journal, it's very strict and rigorous, and we want to have the space be open for people to explore things from art to psychoanalysis, but relate all of them together because we don't think that we can categorize things in themselves and everything is a conversation. And yeah, this is a quote by Lacan that Yusuf and I read at our last cartel meeting. The master breaks the silence on anything with a sarcastic remark and kickstart. That is how a Buddhist master conducts his search for meaning according to the technique of Zen. It behoves the student to find out for themselves the answer to their own questions. The master does not teach ex cathedra or ready-made science. He supplies the answer when the students are on the verge of finding it. So as usual with Lacan, what the fuck is Lacan talking about? Lacan emphasizes that the master or some sort of ex cathedra structures that we have here, we don't want to teach a ready-made science. This isn't a box that we're going to try to impose on people and have them specifically look at philosophy and psychoanalysis from one perspective. This sort of previous view fits perfectly with the institute dedicated to exploration and critique rather than doctrinal instruction. So we are going to reject the top-down model of knowledge. Of course I gave a lecture, but no one here knows in advance what thinking must be, and that's something that just like the students he supplies an answer, they're on the verge of finding it. I've read that a few times and we just don't know what that means. But maybe by our 8th cartel meeting we'll have a good understanding. So yeah, and last of all, obviously we won't critique. Everyone here who studies philosophy knows that society is going down some paths that are more and more difficult to understand. And this is a discipline that's going to keep us grounded and ultimately honest. And it means criticizing both our own work as well as the work that other people produce, and as well as the social structures and mechanisms in play that have power, information, etc., even in cultural field. So, Yusuf, going to come up and introduce yourself as well. It's lovely, Yusuf.
Thank you very much, Dragan. So my name is Yusuf Mubarak. I'm originally from Saudi Arabia. I studied registration, my neuroscience and psychology course in King's College London. Thank God I finished it. As well as held radio interview. But I met actually, so I'm now, my main research concern is time perception. Which I would try to link philosophy and psychology and neuroscience together. And this research just comes from the belief that their perception perhaps it's a good link into the consciousness. And I do believe that Lacan could help me also in the research and could help both of us in understanding the reality of human being perhaps in the world. I met Dragan in a beautiful scene and a good moment. We get linked by President of Philosophy Society people, and then we met in Lacan event, and then we went to study Lacan together in the cafe, and then he came up with a beautiful idea of creating the society, and I can witness that he makes a lot of effort, and it was only a drop of sand in the sea of his work actually. So we are excited. Seems the title for me now is Vice President. We will make our best to to deliver, as you said, authentic and a kind of mixing. We try to bring all things together because we are human who screams for meaning that we don't actually reach to. So it's precisely about coming from this point of view that we don't really know what the hell is going on. So Lacan is a kind of culture that we believe in as a believer, and then we move everyone from his own discipline, to get something. So I don't want to take over this introduction to myself. Thank you very much, Dragan.
So Yusuf is the vice president and the official poet of the LSPPS. He's going to be writing ballads and sonnets because he's very, very good with words, so he should be the one up here speaking. I'm going to jump right in to subjectivity and what this means. The subject is precisely what it's not. People who study Lacan have seen this diagram before. It's the diagram of the barred subject. We're going to go into sort of a deeper explanation of what the barred subject is a little bit later. But why are we dedicating such a large time to the concept of the subject? I mean, we know what we are. Many philosophers start from the idea that self-knowledge exists. The reasons why, because every single question we're going to ask is about desire, meaning, knowledge, power, and community. And that all presupposes that we have an idea of what the subject is. And yet, as soon as we try to define it, as you and I know, the subject slips away. So it's never simply present, it's never identical to itself, it's never reducible to having a stable interior. To speak of the subject is to speak of a gap and monk, which refers to, around our thoughts, actions, and identities. And in this sense, everything from henceforth will be dealing with a Lacanian subject. We thought about diving into idealism first, and that is the second half of what we're doing, but before we get to Immanuel Kant, which is a difficult subject to reach in the first place, we must confuse ourselves first. We can't merely skim the surface of what these luminary thinkers are trying to achieve. When we look into the pond of consciousness, of what philosophy is, we don't want the water to be settled. We want to agitate the body of the water so that we see ourselves in the world for what it really is, fragmented and unsettled. So now we're into the world of imaginaire and imaginary, which is one of the three Lacanian registers. So desire is the desire of the other. Similarly to the proto-human story in the Hegelian myth, this early human who hasn't really seen anybody else and is walking out in the wilderness and experiences the presence of another human being. Lacan argues that in that same way, each of us starts out with seeking recognition, reconnaissance, to be recognized. Desire is precisely what motivates our encounter with the other. Our encounter with the other occurs simultaneously with the emergence of desire. Le désir et le désir de l'autre, the desire of the other. This must be read in multiple ways. It's the key desire of another person. Of course, we might wish to be desired by somebody else or to have them recognize us. But desire is also modeled of other people and what their desires are. We don't wish to drive fancy sport cars because that is an internal desire. It's out there and it's a modeled order. So the manner in which we see desire and the things that we desire are a function of what we see others desiring. So if desire is a desire of the other, in the sense that we wish to be desired by the other, we desire another's desire. Confusing, yeah. But in this wanting to be wanted, we also recognize a base sociality. So we talk about the encounter, and one of the others that we encounter at this formative idea and level is ourselves, or rather the idea of ourselves. As an infant, a small child, Lacan typically noticed this was between the age of 6 to 18 months. All of us encounter, well, at some point, our image in a mirror, and we all experience a combination of jubilation, disappointment, anticipation, antagonism. Sometimes I get disappointed when I look in the mirror these days, so. But for Lacan, the human infant is born premature, so it's an natural view. He takes the idea from biology, specifically from Louis Bolk, that prematuration is specifically human. I mean, look at babies, they're completely helpless. deer come out and they can walk and they're a bit wobbly, and then there's other species of animals where children are released into life and they can figure out on their own. Look at sea turtles, it's terrifying. That little walk from the beach to the water is a war zone. So unlike other creatures, human babies are entirely physically dependent. The child develops an awareness of its dependence, giving it a sense of their own incapacity or inability. It can see other people walking, it can see other people talking, feeding themselves, but the baby itself cannot. So Lacan argued through his research, and especially in his early years, that this gives rise to this disjunction between what the child sees and what it experiences. So this disjunction itself is carried through its own encounter with a mirror. It sees a coherent identity, a sense of what a figure of one, what the baby is, and at the same time, the child's day-to-day experience of being a baby is completely disconnected physically. Without the visual distance of the mirror, the experience of one's body is less coherent, and even more so to an infant who lacks the abstract idea of what a body itself should be, until which to map their experience, they don't have any prior knowledge of what it is to be a body. And additionally, when looking into the mirror, the image we see is not a perfect representation. It's often either distorted, enlarged. It's not the same mirror, it's not the same image that we see in photographs of ourselves. The mirror only presents a surface, and even only that, only the front surface of the body, which is something that we're going to discuss about in the case of Joël, which is one of the autistic children that Lacan had an encounter with in his early years. Nevertheless, we experience a variety of moods, pains, tribulations, anxieties, which are not reflected perfectly by this idea of mirror. It doesn't completely encapsulate what we are. So it means that the mirror image is very different. And I chose this painting specifically because it's got fragments of body types, and especially in music intelligence research with people with schizophrenia as well, who don't have a good idea of what their body represents. They experience their body as different parts and fragments. And this is kind of what the experience pre-mirror stage might feel like initially. This means that the mirror image is very different from the immediate experience we have of ourselves. And in the case of the infant, we can imagine that the mismatch between lived experience and reflection is really distinct. For the experience of the infant is formative. So that's why Dragan refers to it as the mirror stage, because it is in fact an event. An adult experiencing indigestion, for example, stomach pain, while looking in the mirror is not concerned that the mirror doesn't represent the internal conflict he's experiencing. But an infant does not know how to reason a mismatch between the interior and the reflection. Additionally, in clinical cases of anorexia or body dysmorphia are perfectly good examples of this. And since the infant has no prior idea of what they are, their formative encounters are based on this disjunction between an image, bodily experience, and then the reinforcement of that image is them. They have parents behind them who look, what's you? Like they use their body, and one is an image, again, and the other one is internal. So this is the concept of reconnaissance. And this disjunction is termed by Lacan as reconnaissance, and he has a play on words for those who speak French. Naissance is the term born, and he puts that into this recognition. It's one of his neologisms, and he has many. And we basically mistake the image in the mirror as ourselves. And it's not to say that it is a mistake in the sense that there's some sort of truth in what we ourselves are. Culture's meant to be filled with the idea of being a true self. But Lacan kind of pushes back against this idea that I'm a mistaken identity of ourselves, and that there is nothing else. The idea gleaned from the mirror is the entire basis of our identity, and as we're going to sort of explore, if it's one thing that we want to explore throughout the series, is that it's not only the mirror in themselves, but the things that we also see about us. And we have to talk a bit about Freud as well, if we're going to talk about Lacan. And in his paper, the stage of the mirror, or the mirror stage, as the formative function of I. So I, in the sense of I, identity or personhood, is described as a function, so it's not a substantive entity. And this kind of relates to Freud's triad of the ego and the superego. Of course, these are Lacanizations of a translation by James Strachey, but Freud himself talks in German of das Es, das Ich, and das Über ist, which are really hard to translate into English. So the German version of it encapsulates quite a lot what he's trying to say. So This might be common information to people, but we're going to go through it because I think it's really relevant for the basis of our conversations. But the ego in itself, the function of I is understood as talking of the ego, and how it appears to be analyzed in speech. The analysis is the patient. It's just a term. According to Freud, the ego is the role in mediating between the id and reality. It is often obliged to clothe the unconscious with commands of the id with its own pre-conscious rationalizations, to conceal the id's conflicts with reality, to profess. So that's what the ego is, whereas the id is the unconscious source of all bodily needs, impulses, and desires, especially those related to aggression and sexual desire. Acts according to the pleasure principle. Freud described it as the dark, inaccessible part of our personality. Understanding of it is limited to analysis, and the analysis of dreams and of neurotic symptoms that present themselves, either in cases of hysteria, neurosis, or perversion. It has no organization, no collective will. And lastly, when we talk about the superego, it represents the internalization of cultural rules, mainly as absorbed from parents in the initial formation of the child, authority figures, and the general culture ethos. You can kind of see that it's going to relate to what Lacan refers to as a symbolic order. So Freud differentiated the ego, the I, from the superego, pointing out our sense of identity is life is partial. So we're going to talk about the mirror image and the case of Joelle. This case of the autistic girl that Freud first wrote about, and it's a common case amongst the initial mental clinics that were set up in France and Belgium for children with really severe inabilities to integrate themselves into society. Of course, there was a lot more stigma about autism then, and it was more difficult for them to be integrated into society as a whole. Now, of course, there's methods and special education programs, but before they would be sent to sanatoriums where they would be taken care of. By identifying with a mirror image, we start to build an idea of self which grows and solidifies. And since this identification is based on an external image, the fundamental flaw lies that we do this in the sake of another, of an alien invader. The foreigner doesn't possess our unhappiness, our pain. It's completely disjointed and uncoordinated. That means that, number one, it does not find our own experience of inner body, but it also creates a three-way dynamic. So we set up an external identification, which, since it's flawed, it's a rivalry, antagonism. This foreigner, this other, is what Lacan said, I've interjected, is much better than I am. So that's essentially what we've done. We perform for another. It's more whole, it's more capable. To feel this antagonism or aggression is one thing, but aggression is turned towards yourself. The perceived distance between image experience is what Lacan terms an anticipation. I know that right now I am not this ideal I that I see in front of me, but I believe that one day I can be. So it is precisely through what we are not, what we are lacking, that the lack itself being this junction between the eternal day-to-day being of me and the image that I see in front of me, that we come to experience desire, a desire for what we make us whole and bridge that lack. Again, so referring to the case of Joelle, this case is very interesting. It precisely encapsulates what is meant by the imaginary stage. And this girl, she presented symptoms of mania when mirrors were set up to reflect the backside of her body. So she experienced extreme neurosis, and another one was that people in the clinic and in the sanatorium would frequently ask her on occasion to wash herself, and she would only wash the front side of her body and leave the back side of her body completely untouched, which indicates that she had no experience that the back side of her body even existed. And this is the case with severe cases of autism, and especially due to this mirror image, is that there is a recognition that the I that I see in front of me exists in the mirror. But since she doesn't have access to the rear side, when she first experienced this junction, when she first saw herself in the mirror, it means that she only sees half of her existence. So it's a super interesting case. That one really pushed forward Freud's research, and also really pushed forward Lacan's research in coming up with this function of I for the mirror stage. But the mirror stage is not a stage. There is an ambivalent antagonism that is established between the child and its mirror image. There is a clear reconnaissance that we talked about before, when the child mistakes its image as itself. This is not a developmental stage, not something that goes on through a process. It's an ongoing method of always failing identification, which affects adults just as much as infants. So it's not like you have it once and you're done. It's something that we continuously dialogue with. The mirror as a physical object represents a particular experience, but it's only one variation in this response. A really funny example that we talked about in the cartel was that children tend to cry when they see other children fall down and scrape their knee. That's one of the observations that Lacan did in his infant practices. And it seems strange, but infants are not capable of identifying or making a distinction between the other and themselves, especially infants who have difficulties with social inclusion. And they tend to get their emotive responses they tend to externalize their emotive responses. It is also why with small infants, when they hit themselves and if the parent has an over-exaggeration, also like in the UK, starts acting very emotionally, the child tends to cry more than if the parent is cool and composed, because they literally outsource their emotions and they outsource the sense of identity. They even outsource the pain to the reaction of the parent. So that is exactly what we talk about when we talk about the imaginary. So again, to go over the imaginary, we build up a sense of self, ideas, and these are all drawn from external encounters. This allows us to create an identity, and of course, we always talk about what we are and what our identities are, but this is an imagined identity, which is both the fruit and the basis of the imaginary dimension. So our idea of self is based on a minimal recognition or identification of the external image. From this, we build further elements of identification, and this continues until our death. It's an ongoing process. So there's no start point or end point. We're always circling around this need for self-identification. It then forms the basis of relationships with other people and ourselves. It's not a fixed identity. When the mirror encounter occurs, its form is only partial. The shape that the child identifies with is kind of like a casing, and there's more the shape of the casing than the child itself. There's the change, the shape may change as we get older and as we grow, and how the child views itself changes as well, although the child assumes that the casing is themselves. Over time, we fill in the roles: mother, parent, guardian, student, son, and we become more and more fixed relatively as these are enforced by society. And that's why the symbolic order is so important, because that's precisely what reinforces this idea. So we've seen that there's a gap between ourselves and the mirror image, but now let's consider the gap in the wider context of the child's coming to grasp the permanent incompleteness of itself. So the mirror image conveys the physical dimension as the image. It's the imaginary dimension. The imaginary is about appearances, misrecognition, and the ego. We think that we know who we are, but that image is always a fiction. And it's a surface illusion covering deeper unconscious desires. And that's something, a topic that we think would be really interesting for our first ever journal. It's coming out spring 2026, and as like this and shameless promotion now, please do write for it. We're going to take in a lot of applications, especially on the topic of subjectivity. Make it about art, make it about literature. We don't care. We want to read over the applications. It'll be super fun. So now we want to talk about, we just finished the imaginary, the case of Little Hans. It's a very strange case. I unfortunately can't see it very well, but when I was younger, I loved A Christmas Carol and the Disney version, and I was really scared of seeing the horses. I don't know if you guys remember it. If you guys ever watched A Christmas Carol, then now's the perfect time. It's Christmas around the corner. But an amazing movie. I loved it, but this one was absolutely terrifying. It was probably even scarier for Little Hans had he been alive to watch it. So Freud introduces Hans as a clinical case about phobia and the Oedipus complex, and I thought it was super interesting to relate that to the imaginary. Lacan reads this case on a completely different level. So for Lacan, Little Hans will try to construct a coherent ego image in the middle of overwhelming internal experiences: fear, desire, rivalry, bodily sensations that cannot yet symbolize. So Little Hans is basically a child drowning in the imaginary, and here's how the case went to the imaginary. So méconnaissance, Hans mistakes an image for the truth of his fear. Freud says that Hans feared horses because they symbolize the father. Lacan would say that Hans misrecognizes his own internal conflict by projecting it onto the image of the horse. So here we see Lacan's continuous rereadings of Freudian cases. So, for example, the image of the horse's large mouth is the father's threatened by, he sees the black harness, that was referring to his father's mustache, and he sees the blinkers, and those refer to his father's spectacles. The horse becomes the imaginary double of the father, a visual surface that condenses meaning. Just like the mirror stage infant, he mistakes the reflected image for the coherent eye. Kant mistakes the horse image for this coherent source of anxiety. So this is literally how the ego forms around a totalizing misrecognition. And the horse becomes Hans's ego ideal. It's the powerful, coherent figure he wants to measure himself against. He's tiny, he's dependent on his parents, he's fragmented and confused. The horse is big, strong, upright, unified, visually imposing. In the imaginary, children identify with powerful external images. So the horse does not just become a threat, it's also Hans's ego ideal, the image of the father he wishes to rival, resemble, and ultimately surpass. And Lacan's phrase for this dynamic is an image in which the child sees what he is not and what he could become. And this relates as well to aggressivity and rivalry. Of course, this is a crux of Freudian cases. He was very concerned with sexuality, which is something that Lacan kind of turned down a little bit because it was really a bit off the rails towards the end of Freud's life. The imaginary is always a mixture of fascination, rivalry, aggression, and he's terrified of his father image. But he also simultaneously plays at being a rider. He sits on a horse, symbolically, and he masters the horse. His father and him used to play horses when they were young. He wants to be like the father, large, powerful, but he fears him intensely at the same time. So this dual dynamic of I love this image, I hate this image, I want to be this image, is exactly what Lacan talks about in the mirror stage. Identification and repositioning is something that Freud helped the child undergo through transference, and transference is also something that we're going to talk about later. It's when emotions, feelings, and sort of insecurities and anxieties are projected onto the role of the analyst from the analyzer or the patient. So this phobia resolves itself when he finally repositions himself inside the family image. His two final fantasies through his dreams of having children with his mother and receiving a new, bigger Riddler from the plumber, you can infer what that means, are merely political in the Freudian sense. This term repositioning in this context refers to how Hans himself mentally and emotionally relocates himself in relation to his parents and desires. So he goes from threatened subject to empowered subject. So yeah. We're going to read a lot of Freudian cases. I thought it was interesting to throw a few in the next in case you haven't seen them before, or in case you never want to hear about them again because they're so strange. But we're going to throw them a little bit in the mix because it's really interesting to see how these cases developed over a long period of time. And yeah, the Lacanian lesson, Freud thinks Hans fears the father, but Lacan says Hans fears the image of the father that he himself has constructed, the imaginary father. And that's something that I really encourage us to look at as a collective in culture theory as well. Art obviously reflects a lot of insecurities and fears, and it would be interesting to see how we can use this term of the imaginary to discuss how news, art, sexuality are all interrelated. So yeah, we've sort of covered the subject, and it's a little bit confusing. But we're going to jump ahead on critical theory. Have a lot of people studied here critical theory? Have you guys done some research on it? Yeah, we know lots. We're not going to spend too much time on it, but it's a beautiful picture. It's very HD. It's the best I could find. But you've got some prominent figures, including Rosa Luxemburg there. I love Rosa Luxemburg, which is great. So what makes critical theory critical, and why are we even talking about critical theory in this context? So at first, we might think that critical theory is upon us, criticizing something society. But in a reductionist way, we can't just say that it really does that. We can't just say that it criticizes, because it would make critical theory anything, it would make it less than any other form of critique. And that vein, more philosophical movements of the 20th century were critical theory. But Max Horkheimer, he's one of the founders of the Frankfurt School. He set out to differentiate Frankfurt School from the other movements that came in the 1920s, 20s, and 30s of the historical context. These included branches of things like neo-Marxism, the logical positivists of the Vienna School, Wittgenstein, and of course, one of his biggest personages, of course, would be Nietzsche, and the irrationalist idealism in that sense. His first occurrence of the term critical came in 1937 in his seminal essay, Traditional and Critical Theory, where he basically says science can no longer explain what is happening in society and it's turns to critical theory. So he wants to return to idealism and specifically to Immanuel Kant, as I promised we would speak about Kant, but we're not going to go incredibly in depth because first of all, and second of all, we're going to take only the essence of the subject. In a way, Kant is the first critical philosopher in the sense that he first considers both the object and subject of critique, and that's why we spent so long earlier discussing what the subject is. For Kant, critique is not the matter of fault finding and finding simple skepticism arguments like in the Cartesian way. For those who read Meditations, he kind of says, I know nothing at all, he begins from that first assumption. But it's a rigorous examination under the conditions under which knowledge and experience are themselves possible. So Kant's central innovation lies in recognizing that philosophy has to investigate its objects, the phenomena that we perceive, but also the subject that perceives them. So in a sense, Lacan also even from there kind of picks up his ideas, and even though he claims he's the world's biggest anti-philosopher, he is in fact a philosopher, and I don't care what anyone says he is one. In other words, critique must account for both what is knowing and who is doing the knowing. So Kantian theory permits me to seek beyond the bounds of knowledge, while at the same time acknowledging what the subject of critique, like I'm doing thinking that's called the Kantian dialectic, and a lot of the word dialectic in and of itself in philosophy, in history of philosophy, changes so many times. Obviously you have those Socratic dialectics and Plato, what Plato means by dialectics. Then you have Hegel, who completely changes the idea of what dialectics are. And then you have Marxist dialectics. So we're going to try to find dialectic each one so it doesn't get way too confusing among us. But this is the kind of dialectic. It's the idea to sort of seek beyond the bounds of knowledge, but at the same time self-criticize and acknowledge the limits of knowledge. So at the heart of this is the concept of the transcendental, which philosophy you've definitely read about. It's what makes knowledge itself possible. Using the great diagram that I've got from my YouTube page. The other diagrams are pretty ugly, but this one kind of does a good job of explaining what is going on. We have the appearance of objects of experience, and obviously the thing in itself, the transcendental, what is outside, we can't really directly grasp, but it is what permits us to understand things such as space and time, for example, in the first place. You can ask, like, what are these structures, forms, and capacities of mind that shape how objects even present themselves to us? I've got this lovely pink music stand in front of me, but the very fact that I recognize it is pink and I see it as an object in space and time means that there are some inherent mental faculties, transcendental, that allow me to experience this in the first place. But his critical project is fundamentally self-positive. Critique must always interrogate its own limits. It must ask, okay, what can I reasonably claim? Where does reason overstep? And critique of pure reason. This is the essence of his transcendental dialectic. Reason itself naturally tends towards totality, seeking unconditioned principles and ultimate truths. That's so easy to find in there with metaphysical science and condense everything to rational system of knowledge. But when reason tries to go around this bound of what is even possible in experience, when we try to seek knowledge of things in themselves, noumena is what he refers to them as, it falls into antinomies and contradictions. And this is what ultimately Lacan will pick up through his examples of literature and metaphors, that this is the only way we can sort of grasp these differences. An implication of Kantian critique is that the subject is not pre-given, autonomous, fully capable, but it's always structured by its cognitive faculties, and at the same time the subject is an active agent and an active activation of reason, organizing and synthesizing experience. So then this is what Horkheimer tries to do with his double critique, and this is why he wants to go back to German idealism. And he kind of wants to avoid these reductionist models of the Vienna school and what he would call vulgar Marxism. Vulgar Marxism was the reduction of Marxism to only scientific principles and claimed that human agency was not responsible for how reason understands itself. It would literally just be a sort of social science study that the Frankfurt School would usually start to do, but with the entry of Horkheimer and Horkheimer becoming president of the Frankfurt School, kind of ripped that away and really wanted to focus and return to idealism. So what he wants to do is completely rip apart this purely materialist claim that neo-Marxists are doing, and he kind of wants us to think about rational idealism. So he's kind of reinventing and reintegrating idealism into philosophy, because after Hegel, there has been a lot of criticism, especially by continental philosophers, especially in the UK, of what they claim it always results in intuitional idealism, what Nietzsche would claim as, as power, or even things that Schopenhauer would talk about as in terms of will. If you read A Will Representation, it's a really nice book to read just in and of itself. Nietzsche wrote a really funny thing about Schopenhauer. Schopenhauer was the biggest pessimist of all time. He says, there's this thing called will, and you're subject to the will, and that's what causes so much conflict and misery and all these things. But he played the flute every single night, and he was just an artist, and so he really loved art. So kind of Nietzsche always poked jabs at this sort of pessimistic view that Schopenhauer had. But what is the problem with idealism as a whole? Because Horkheimer doesn't want to take all idealism and be like, okay, this is the basis of how we define critical theory, so when I talk about this is exactly how it occurs in society. And it kind of comes with what Horkheimer calls the Klärung. It's very difficult to translate it into English, but the best term would be transfiguration. Since Plato, certain philosophical interpretations of the world have always collapsed into a transcendental theodicy. There's this world that exists that I see here and now, the world of becoming, the world of particulars. But outside this universe, there's some unattainable ideals that exist. The best example is Plato's forms, right? Because of Plato, chairs exist here in real life, but there is some ideal form of chair that exists in this transcendental universe. We're never going to reach the ideal form of chairs. All particulars are only capable of shaping themselves based on chairs. Aristotle would kind of push back against this, and we talk about things, we talk about causes, especially final causes, for example. But again, it kind of refers to this idea that there is some sort of transcendental theodicy. And this was also really reflected in Plato's theology. If you guys have read the Phaedrus, it's one of my favorite books by Plato. His idea of this demiurge that controls the world from the outside, who is ultimately good, is a great example of what this is. And I liked A.C. Ewing's definition of idealism. It's very reductionist and pessimistic, but I think that's precisely what Horkheimer's trying to avoid. And it's just the idea that no physical objects exist apart from experience, but there's something called an absolute experience, or the experience of a God, which is ultimately unattainable in our day-to-day, but exists beyond. And outside of human experience, there is some transcendental thing that permits us to interpret the world. And for Horkheimer, it's that clear. The basic principles are that there is this thing called V, that's what he assigned to it, a mathematical value, that's supposed to be a stand-in for many things, both material, non-material. It's the idea that this thing V is thought to be valuable, but not present in the world as such. Horkheimer recognized there's still a lot of suffering. The social classes have not lifted up and freed themselves from the chains of capitalism. Happiness, freedom are not universally present in a world more reachable. And idealism just does in a sense of saying that, the fact that we don't have pure happiness and absolute happiness in the world is thought to be because of the immutable nature of reality. Reality itself doesn't allow for it. But it still exists. There's still there are still these values that exist, but it's impossible in our real world that exists, and it's only attainable in the supernatural world. So some examples include Plato's ideals, the res cogitans, Schopenhauer's will, Kant's summum bonum, Hegel's Geist, for example, etc., etc. There's many examples. But his goal essentially is to collapse this theodicy while maintaining that the centrality of the human subject is the rational agent. So Kant's transcendental idealism that we just looked at in our previous diagram is a great framework for understanding the conditions under which knowledge and experience are possible. For Kant, the subject is not just the passive receiver of reality, and the mind itself actually structures experiences over the faculties. But Horkheimer says, yeah, well, not all of Kant can be taken. Leclerc is the problem with it, and it's a move that Kant kind of gets away with a lot of his philosophy by allowing it to become some sort of transcendental theodicy. And this summum bonum, this highest good, where virtue and happiness coincide, and where the good is, serves as a regulative idea. It's a moral ideal that guides action, but in its complete realization, it's not guaranteed by some sort of empirical reality in the here and now. Similarly, Kant's numinal realm, things in themselves, they exist as a necessary conceptual limit to knowledge. So Horkheimer really argues here that these moves risk Lacan by relocating some sort of ideal into some transcendental realm beyond the empirical world. Even in this Kantian moral epistemological framework, philosophy kind of stops. Philosophy slips into a form of transcendentalism. And these ideals themselves become untouchable and hence irrelevant almost in society, because they are completely untouchable, which is something that is the collapse of a lot of German idealism that came in this sort of genealogy from Kant to Hegel. So in other words, he provides the structural roots, by him and Kant, to understand how the subject mediates reality, but Horkheimer says no, we have to warn against these structures, because these justifications for idealism in its traditional Leclercian fused form are not sufficient. The Kantian subject, which he wants to keep the idea of the Kantian subject, that remains. However, we can no longer depend on the structures of thought or abstract ideals. Ideals like freedom or happiness should be immanent to human life for critical theory, not confined to some transcendental or metaphysical sphere. And, this is where critical theory takes a Marxist turn, and in some sense it's not that different from Marxism. Even though Marxism is a materialist philosophy, the very fact that it requires human as subject to experience this materialism in the first place almost keeps in mind some of these ideas from German idealism, which is why the title of, well, if you went on our website, the photo, which by the way, it came out horrible on our website. Someone DM'd us saying that our website was really bad and he could help fix it up for us. So maybe we're going to be doing that. The photo I chose was Marx flipping Hegel on his head. And in this flipping, of course, from idealism to materialism, he still keeps a lot of the original ideas. So orthodox Marxism, and these include Engels, Lacan, Kautsky, Lenin. If you read Lenin, it's tough to read. It's very boring and very mathematical. But anyway, they turn Marxism into a science of history. So it's where material base itself determines ideology, superstructure. Human consciousness is just like a reflection of all material conditions. The revolution occurs when contradictions of capitalism reach their breaking point. So in a way, traditional Marxism was sort of this anticipatory thing. And at the end of Lenin's book, Imperialism, the highest form of capitalism, he talks about how he goes on to this entire economic breakdown of what capitalism is and how the big banks are controlling the world, and these sort of Leninist conspiracies that he keeps on going, but which in fact at that time were true. He kind of goes on and preaches on about how countries on the brink or on the outside of capitalism, they only have two choices, either to subject to imperialism or to join the revolution. And of course, Imperialism, the highest form of capitalism, that book was a revolutionary text. He wrote that when he was in Switzerland, and it was severely published throughout the by the Russians of the world, as well as in England and Germany. And by the 1920s, 30s, the world did not fit these deterministic laws. Capitalism did not collapse, it just reinvented itself. The working class failed to revolt, and they were immediately absorbed by other classes. Now we have a mass consumer culture. Horkheimer in the 30s, after the failed revolutions, kind of looks around and goes, what happened? We were promised this thing revolution was inevitable. So the question the Frankfurt School had to ask was, okay, if material base determines consciousness, how did consciousness start supporting its own domination? That's the big question of the Frankfurt School. How did this come to be? What he realized is that there exists something in the structure of reason, culture, and subjectivity that itself reproduces domination. In and of itself, inside, interior, idealist. So this was the Frankfurt School's necessary return to rational idealism. In this, he has to strictly denounce what traditional theory is. Traditional theory is scientific and it explains cultural phenomena, but they have a clear distinction, and this is really important, between theory and praxis. So theories in and of themselves merely picture the world, and this is one of the great conversations I had a few days ago at the pub. We were talking about how theories function, and obviously he's a neuroscientist, so I have to push back against what he was saying, but scientists apply theories to epistemological observations of the universe, and they systematically draw these conclusions from their observations. But the theories do little else. Traditional theory fails to recognize that the very fact that what even makes theoretical investigation possible in the first place is the result of some sort of a priori rational understanding about the world, the semantic field, the categories, and how the fact they're already predetermined. In order to study stars or black holes, in order to make sense of biology, there has to be some sort of predefined, somehow historical form of knowledge that exists. And for Kant, these are a priori categories that are immutable. They existed from the beginning, from human conception to the end. These things don't change in history, and this is precisely where Horkheimer says, okay, enough of Kant. This guy, I've had enough of him. We're going to keep the fact of the subject critiquing itself, but we have to turn to Hegel, and we're going to talk more about Hegel in the next session, which is a bit of a snooze, but I promise it's really relevant to what we're going to talk about next. But we're going to give a really, really brief introduction on Hegel, on medical theories. So he saw the pre-existence of these medical theories, however, they're not immutable and unchanging, and belonging to some sort of higher plane of existence. So for Hegel, and this is the main things that also we want to take from this as we develop into sort of a school or some sort of collective, is that we have to recognize that knowledge in and of itself is holistic and historical. Hegel recognized that semantic categories, and this is something that's really important in structural linguistics, and that's what structural linguistics tries to highlight, is that as existence must unfold as Geist realizes absolute spirit. Hegel's a romantic. There was a famous story of a German playwright, his name right now, who invited Hegel over to dinner, and his daughter was a huge fan of Hegel. She had read Hegel all the time, and he gets invited, but he doesn't tell his daughter that Hegel's coming. They get this mysterious guest at the table. This guy's a bit like the Slavoj Žižek of German intellectuals. He's this strange man. He's spitting everywhere, spilling his wine, and going on about crazy theories. And he asks his daughter, what do you think of our guest? Absolutely not on that one. So that was Hegel. So that's a really good story about Hegel. Hegel was very romantic in his explanations, and he also was very difficult to understand. I don't know if you guys have read the Phenomenology of Spirit, but you can be stuck on one sentence or once, and that is true. So what Hegel was trying to talk about basically was that the human agent must also necessarily, and human agent as reasonable subject and subject who reasons, he has to unfold with history. And it's obvious, like freedom in ancient Greece meant one thing, and that participating in the polis, being able to not being a slave in Greek culture, but freedom afterward, after Enlightenment, meant autonomy, and it meant freedom had a completely different sort of meaning, and that's exactly what we will study with Lacan the symbolic order of how meaning itself has changed and how important the role of structural linguistics is. So Horkheimer attempts to rebuild Marxism after the scientific project of critical theory by really mining into sort of this rationalist idealism, this genealogy from Kant to Hegel, that would serve to explain a lot of the failures of the revolution and how we still remain subjugated to systems of domination. And this is what what this new current of philosophy is. You know, we have people like Zizek, Judith Butler. We have a lot of these figures who kind of really took this idea from critical theory and tried to implement it, especially with psychoanalysis, which is what and precisely why we went to schools, because that's where we see philosophy going in the next 10 to 20 years. After that, I'm not quite sure, but we'll have to see. But we're going to conclude with love Photoshop. Isn't he such a sweetie? There's a lot of pictures of him in like bow ties, and he's just really cute. He's always smiling, but he's got something on. He's probably thinking about other discomfort or something. So, we're really happy that you guys came, and we're so elated that you guys traveled into cold weather to come see me speak. I'm personally honored by this. You guys have no idea who I am. My name's Dragan. I'm the guy who's been sending all this stuff in the chat. So happy to see all your faces in person. And we think we have something really special here, and we're going to be doing a lot more things in the future. If you're really, really interested, apply to the board position. I'm sorry if I haven't got back to you yet. We've got like thousands of notifications in our Google Forms, and it's been really difficult to get through them. But if you have applied, we're going to hear back soon. And we're going to do really cool things, such as dinner series and kind of getting to know each other better, kind of having like a social ground as well. We can talk about stuff, and we can meet other study people in online and discussing philosophy and whatnot. But anyway, we're super happy that you guys came, and just to sort of follow up on what we talked about the imaginary. If you're interested in reading more about that, I really recommend Bruce Fink's book. He's a very good author on Lacan. There's Introduction to Jacques Lacan by Bruce Fink. Yusuf saved me with Lacan by putting me onto a book called Introduction to Jacques Lacan by Callum Neal. I'll send all of these afterwards in the chat. Maybe Yusuf will already send them. I'm not even quite sure yet. But yeah. The Callum Neal and Bruce Fink are two great names. Zizek's also written a book called Looking Awry, but that one was really, really, really confusing. It's terrible, that one. I had to put it down halfway through. Like, okay, I understand the context and everything now. And then we went to critical theory as well. But if you have any questions, feel free to ask about LSPPS or something else. Yes.
Hi, that was really great. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
I guess I'm just curious about your marrying of critical theory and analysis. I mean, is this the time to ask questions about the lecture content, or?
Yeah, of course, yeah.
Well, well, I guess like my experience with critical theory is more through Adorno than Horkheimer.
Yeah.
Of course, Adorno is like markedly anti-Hegelian in this way that he exposes Hegelian logic as this kind of like the fetish of the synthesis, right? But then Lacan is, in very many ways, is a Hegelian in the sense that identity is always like inevitable for Lacan. So I was wondering, if we're passing through critical theory through Horkheimer, I haven't read Horkheimer, where does Horkheimer position himself on that, and how do we, and if his position is similar to Adorno,
Yes. Well,
is there a sense of...
the interesting thing about Horkheimer is he founded the Frankfurt School, but as Adorno rose in the ranks of critical theory, Horkheimer became smaller and smaller in importance, and Horkheimer started recognizing this, that Adorno was this really smart, intelligent thinker, as you said, very anti-Hegelian, and there were limits to it. And there's this really good book by Fred Rush, An Introduction to Critical Theory. It kind of goes through the sort of all the topics and how this happened. And yes, so of course, the most famous book of critical theory is Dialectic of Enlightenment. It's an amazing book. I'm still going through it right now, but essentially, Adorno kind of takes over the main waves of this anti-Hegelian move, and obviously Lacan is very Hegelian in that sense. But Lacan is specifically anti-Hegelian in the sense that he recognizes that the desire is a desire of the other, and kind of uses that for its basic foundation. But Lacan stops with Hegel immediately after that, because as he does more research on linguistics, and as he comes to realize that being conscious is structured by language, you notice that's where like this Hegelian move towards absolute spirit and all these sort of Hegelian concepts and metacognities fall out, because symbolic order has to be structured in the very fact that we can even express ourselves in words and express and convey meanings are already rooted in something external and not shifting in that sort of sense. But yeah, no, Adorno does in fact sort of, go down this route of questioning Hegel's logic a bit more. And I think the only reason why we pointed out today was because we wanted to sort of look at, well, number one, Hegel's also really interesting to read, so we thought this would be a good way of integrating Hegel into sort of this text that we're studying, and as we talked about with the myth of the proto-human, but also we have to recognize that Hegel's logic does in fact break down with Adorno, and it's no longer bringing it into psychoanalysis.
Also, thank you so much.
Any other questions about LSPPS or what can get involved or anything else? Alright, great. So I've spoken way too much. There's still refreshments and stuff there if you haven't got the coffee, stuff like that. If you want to chat, we're going to hang around here for like another 10 minutes, 10, 15, so however long, and we'd love to like get to your name and speak to you guys. But yeah, thank you so much. Sorry. I'm going to stop the recording just because I got this next one.